In Anatomy and Physiology 1, following a chapter on the muscle tissue, then the labs typically involve a chapter on the muscular system, which goes through the muscles of the body. Now, a lot of this is very anatomy-based and a bit memorization-based, where one says, you know, this muscle exists here, so in lab you might have to identify it, and then you might memorize the places where it begins and ends, its origin and insertion. And in general, the origin is the muscle attachment, which tends not to move, and the insertion, which is the insertion which tends to move. So in other words, for example, if you were to consider the chest muscle, it attaches over here on the sternum, the clavicle, and the ribs, and then it also attaches on the greater tubercle of the humerus. Now, when the chest muscle contracts, what happens? Does A, the arm move, or B, does the sternum rip away from the chest and expose the heart? Obviously, the answer is A. That the arm moves. So even though there are two attachments of this muscle, when the muscle contracts, one moves and the other stays still or tends to. And so that's the difference between, say, the origin and the insertion. On the muscles of the, on the limbs, the origin is identified as the proximal attachment point, while the insertion is the distal attachment point. And when we look at these muscles, very often we refer to what they do. And very often there is a muscle which is primarily responsible for a movement. So it is a prime mover of, say, forearm flexion, like the biceps brachii, or forearm extension, like the triceps brachii. But that being said, muscles can also act as synergists, where even if they're not the prime mover of of a specific action, that nevertheless they are helping that action occur more efficiently. Sometimes they act as fixators, which then stabilize one part of the body while another moves. Some of these are then, if they're prime movers, they are referred to as antagonists. So for example, the biceps brachii, which performs forearm flexion, would then be the antagonist of the triceps brachii, which performs forearm extension. The sternocleidomastoid, which then can flex the neck, then would antagonize the trapezius, which can extend the neck. And so just some general terms. Finally, I don't want to repeat all of the information which I have in my playlist, because I go through all of the muscles and I say, you know, here is the origin, here is the insertion, and then the action, then, you know, the insertion gets pulled towards the origin. This is what the muscle does. If you wanted to, in another chapter, you could then go into the nerves as well. Well, the reason I'm saying this is a lot of students dread this chapter because it seems like a lot of memorization. I have to memorize that. The pectoralis major has its origin on the sternum, the clavicle, and ribs 1 through 7. Its insertion on the greater tubercle of the humerus, and its action is to adduct, flex, and medially rotate the arm. Next, and then go into the next muscle and so forth. So that, you know, that is bad, and obviously I do sympathize with, you know, students. I had to memorize, you know, this once, but I want to emphasize it is not memorization, or at least it doesn't have to entirely be. Maybe even it shouldn't be. And the reason I say this is because if a student memorizes this list, here's a list of origins, insertions, actions that you memorize. Well, the odds are that A, you're going to, in the middle of the exam, forget it, mix it up, you know, get test anxiety, do poorly on the exam. And then B, forget it shortly after the exam, which obviously in education is not the goal. And so I would like to emphasize that you could look at this in a way where you understand it without it being memorization. So just a couple of quick thoughts if this is helpful. First, muscles only pull. Muscles never push. Knowing that, then, if body parts in this plane, and I'm sorry, I'm sitting, you know, if I was in a classroom, I would probably, you know, demonstrate this a little bit better. When we talk about, say, flexion, the neck flexes in this direction. The arm flexes in this direction. The forearm flexes in this direction. The waist flexes in this direction, etc. And so therefore, where would the muscle that does this action have to be? Here on this side. Muscles only pull. So if something's going to make the neck do this, it has to be on this side of the neck, right? Nothing can be on this side of the neck and make the neck do this because muscles do not push. They only pull. So if you are asked what muscle flexes the neck, don't say, oh, I memorized this word is on the list. No, think. It has to be on this side. How many muscles did you study on this side? So for example, in my classes, there's one, the sternocleidomastoid, all right? And so if you only studied one muscle on this side of the neck, and you know that the answer has to be a muscle on this side of the neck, you have the right answer. You reasoned through it, okay? So on abduction, so that is, I'm sorry, before extension, then, well, that's going to be on this side of the body. So the only way the neck does this is if a muscle is pulling from this side. What muscle is on this side of the neck? Well, in our class, we've memorized the trapezius. That's the answer. And so even if you didn't memorize everything, so for example, if you know where a muscle is, that can help you figure out what it does. The muscle, sternocleidomastoid is on this side of the neck. Oh, and on this side of the neck, and flexion is in this direction. So the muscle that performs flexion has to be on this side of the neck, has to be the sternocleidomastoid. The trapezius is on this side of the neck, attaching to the occipital bone. When I extend the neck, I'm pulling the occipital bone in this direction. The muscle that does that has to be on this side of the neck, like the trapezius that extends the neck. The same way, abduction. How could one possibly take my arm and make it do this, all right? Well, the only way is if you attach to this side of the arm and you come in from the lateral side, the proximal end on the lateral side. So if you then take a muscle and you pull, remember, muscles only pull, they don't push. So no muscle down here is pushing the arm up. It's a muscle here that grabs here and pulls. If that's the only place that you can abduct the arm, by attaching to the lateral side on the proximal end. Then you ask, what muscles are here? Well, that would then be the deltoid and the supraspinatus, which is underneath it. So then that would be the muscles which abduct the arm. So if you're asked, what muscles abduct the arm? You would ask, what muscles are here? And then you can figure it out. Same thing on the hip, all right? The only muscles which could abduct the hip would attach to from the lateral side of the proximal end. What muscles are there? The gluteal muscles. That must be the answer. A muscle which adducts a limb, adducting is to pull towards the midline, has to have its origin along the midline. So for example, how would I pull the arm towards the midline? Well, what muscles attach to the arm whose origin is on the midline? Well, the pectoralis major has its origin on the midline here on the sternum. The latissimus dorsi has its origin on the midline on the spinous processes of vertebrae. So if those two muscles pull on the arm, they're pulling it towards the midline here or along the midline of the back. So you then adduct the arm. And so what I highly recommend to students is during an exam, think. Because if you just know a little bit, you can get a lot of right answers, even if there's things that you didn't study. So for example, if you know where a muscle is, then you can figure out what it does. This is the flexor side of the body. This is the extensor side of the body. Knee's the exception, as is mentioned in one of these videos, obviously. It flexes in the opposite direction. So if a muscle's on this side and attaches to the arm, then it's likely to, say, flex the arm or flex the leg in this direction. And then extensors would be on the opposite side. If things are coming in to a proximal end of a limb from the lateral side, they're likely to abduct the limb. If they're pulling on a limb and they attach on the midline, then they're likely to adduct the limb. If you know where it is, you can figure out what it does. If you've memorized what it does, then you can figure out where it is. All right, so if you know the sternocleidomastoid flexes the neck, and you're asked on a lab exam, what is this muscle? It's the sternocleidomastoid, because the muscle which flexes the neck has to be on this side. And then also, one of the things I always tell my lab students, please cheat. All right, now let me define what I mean by cheat. But so many people bomb exams on the bones, on the muscles, they leave things blank, and they forget, you brought bones with you. You brought muscles with you. Use them to get the right answer. If someone asks you, what does this muscle do? Grab it and yank on it. You brought the muscle with you. Use it. So grab the muscle, pull on it, or at the very least, take your hand and say, all right, I'm going to imagine this is the muscle. All right, here's the origin at the palm. Here's the insertion at the fingertips. What would happen if I pull my fingers towards the palm? Oh, this flexes the arm. This does this, this does this. So cheat. Take your hand, touch the muscle, put your palm where the muscle, the origin is, the fingers where the insertion is, and then pull. And so much of this you can reason through. So a lot of students who do horribly on exams on the muscular system, they treat it as this big memorization thing. This muscle has this origin, this insertion, this action, etc. And on the day of the exam, it all rushes together and they do poorly. Whereas some students learn a little bit, but then have the presence of mind to say, all right, well, I know where it is. I can figure out what it does. Or it's here, let me just pull on it or simulate it and see if I can reason through it that way. So as I go through these videos, they go through the, here each muscle is, here's the origin, here's the insertion. And then I highly recommend this final portion. I have a couple of videos that I call zombie muscle yoga. And when I teach class, I have my class stand up and we all do yoga and we all follow along. Where it says, all right, now we're going to be using the biceps brachii. It has this origin, this insertion. Now, obviously, repeating material, repeating it in a new scenario, this is obviously going to help you learn the material. But in all honesty, if you think about yours, if you're looking at the textbook, it seems abstract. But if you're actually exercising or doing yoga or moving your own body, then I think not only is this interesting, it's interesting to say, oh, look at this muscle that does this. I'll bet you in the gym when I'm doing this exercise, I'm working out this muscle or whatever. This is the muscle that's sore, it turns out. But then this is also making it much more likely that you're going to remember it because you're thinking about yours and you've made it more relevant to you. So I have this set of videos, Zombie Muscle Yoga, where I invite my class to do it. If they to follow along, we all stand, we follow along. But otherwise, if you just wanted to watch and say, all right, so here I am moving this muscle. What? Oh yeah, I can feel it medially rotate. Look at this, the pectoralis major. When you pull on it, it medially rotates the arm, whereas the infraspinatus, when you're pulling on it, it laterally rotates the arm. Yeah, I can feel that. You're going to do much better on the exam than the student who just said, I'm going to sit and just stare at the page in the textbook and try to memorize it. So I have playlists on the muscles going through origins, insertions, and actions. And these were just a couple of hints to have it stick with you better so that you do better on the exam.